Welcome everyone. This is the PKI Solutions webinar series, episode 10. Everyone is slowly joining in, so welcome. This is our July 2021 webinar, Preparing for a Permanently Distributed Workforce, 3 Security Steps to Take Now. I'm Mark Cooper. I'm going to be your host and presenter today. And this is one of our ongoing webinar series. If you haven't had a chance to see our previous slides, you can check them out at pkisolutions.com/webinars. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the impact that organizations have had as a result of the past year from the pandemic and other changes to the infrastructure. As I'm going through today, if you'd like to propose any questions, you can do that in our Q&A channel. You can also just introduce yourself and say hi on the chat channel. That's visible to all of the participants today. We'll also be doing a couple polls as we go through. So if you haven't used BigMarker before, you're not familiar with the UI, get a chance to take a look through there. And we look forward to your questions at the end of the session today. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk a little bit about what this concept of the hybrid workforce is. This term's been kind of used more and more lately. We'll talk about what that really means in our context and how this may be seen in your environment. We'll also talk about the tactical changes to your infrastructure that may have happened as a result of the pandemic and this change to the hybrid workforce. I'll try to touch on a little bit of what some of those long-term high-level risks are and try to give you 3 easy-to-follow steps to address these risks. Every organization is going to be a bit unique, and like anything in the security space, it's always difficult to give absolute recommendations that work for everybody. But we're going to try to touch on some of the things that just about any organization can do today to help with some of these risks. We're also going to talk about how you can adapt to the workforce, some of the things that you can do going forward, because essentially, whether you were working with remote workers before or the hybrid workforce is new, there's frankly a new reality that we're all facing. And then we'll take any questions. So as I said, as we go through today, if you'd like to join in the chat, you can also submit on the Q&A channel. And if you submit something on chat that we think is a great question, we'll go ahead and promote that over to the Q&A topic as well. So let's get started. When we talk about the hybrid workforce, what does it really mean? Historically, this used to be what we called the telecommuter or the mobile worker, the resources, employees, contractors that weren't physically on the organizational network or inside of our building. Our telecommuters were oftentimes salespeople or field engineers, line people, people whose job typically had them outside of the office on a regular basis. We also had employees that would, work from home in the evenings or weekends when there was a project that came up. There's been email access that pretty much everyone uses their phone or a tablet to check work email as well. So the telecommuting process isn't really new. But what we really saw most organizations going through last year is this kind of increased deployment to respond to the pandemic. There were a lot of organizations that we worked with where suddenly projects were on hold simply to focus on the enablement. How do we get our workforce going? How do we get our employees accessing the information they need? The focus quickly shifted. And we also saw a greater number of jobs across the organization moving to this telecommuting process. Doctors were suddenly doing telecare. Entertainment industry were suddenly editing movies and TV shows via shared development platforms across broadband connections rather than gathering in a daily theater or going through an editing booth. Government workers, governors and health directors were suddenly doing work from home. They were doing press conferences. All of these things were suddenly being done outside of the normal facility. This is really no longer telecommuting. It became the new way of working. So this hybrid workforce is really one where it's essentially telecommuting for everybody. And it was really focused less on a office-enabled person working remotely to somebody who is permanently working remotely and may never come into the office or very little. We're also seeing this now, just as things in some parts of the world are slowly returning, that the hybrid workforce is one that is still primarily at home and occasionally in the office, so almost the inverse of what we started with. Some businesses now have employees coming in 1 day a week or 1 day every other week. So we're starting to see some of these scenarios where organizations are actually in the inverse scenario. And we still see the same variety of jobs all across the organization that are still in this work from home or work in a remote environment. The other thing that we also saw, and you may have seen in your environment, is some existing tools, some technologies, whether they're remote access or communications, some of those were leveraged and some of them were also augmented very quickly. It could be that organizations already had VPN connectivity for remote workers, but not necessarily everybody in the company had the token they needed or had the access they needed to VPN in, but that was quickly changed. We also saw organizations quickly augment what they had from communications tools such as chat and real-time information. So some tools were already in place and some were quickly added, but all has kind of essentially resulted in how our organizations focused on enabling and getting their workers working regardless of where they're physically located. So what were some of the things that happened? And this is the secondary thing in most people's mind. It was less about what are we changing and why, and more about enablement. How do we get ourselves up and running in the state that we are? So a lot of existing infrastructure was augmented to allow remote work, whether that was network access, expanding VPN access, expanding technology. It was how do we get these systems to a point to make this work? A lot of firewalls and network segmentations and other things may have needed to change, oftentimes overnight or in several weeks, to facilitate getting those workers access to the information that they needed. It was one where we also saw rapid deployment of new tools. I have a doctor friend, and it was actually very interesting in talking to her about how her job changed over the last year to be able to do telemedicine and be able to work from home, and what was already in place versus what was new. The use of WebEx, for instance, to do telemedicine was completely new to them. And the hospital actually, in a matter of a week, spun up access to WebEx and got doctors access very quickly and on a scale that we really wouldn't see in normal circumstances. So a lot of new solutions were found to solve a problem and deployed quickly because that's what the organizations needed. We saw connectivity changes. It was less about who can get on the Wi-Fi and more about who had access to VPN or who had tunnel access or who had a remote computer to be able to access our systems remotely. Some of the financial customers we work with have completely isolated networks, and how do they facilitate management into those environments from a remote perspective, through a bastion host or jump boxes and requirements that previously would have been unthought of suddenly had to be addressed of how are we going to be able to facilitate this. We also saw a lot of new cloud-enabled solutions brought into organizations, whether it was things like Slack and email and cloud services and WebEx and Zoom. There was a lot of, we don't have something in place, we can quickly spin up a third-party provider to do this and get access to the tools that we need. Again, it was all very tactical, very focused work on enabling the workforce, getting organizations up and going. And frankly, I think organizations did a great job. We didn't hear a lot of stories about organizations that failed to find a way to adapt. We we continued to work. And we could always kind of see that ourselves from clients that we worked with, where the second quarter of last year, just as the pandemic was hitting, a lot of things got real quiet, and organizations were dealing internally with taking care of the safety of their employees, but then quickly turning to how do we enable our workforce to continue to go. And we really kind of saw that going into the third quarter. And then things kind of, they felt like they shifted somewhere in the fall. It felt like organizations finally got their feet underneath them as far as their workers getting access. Things were kind of becoming secondary nature, and then they were turning their attention to other matters. But it's something I think most organizations found a way to move forward. And I suspect many of you are in organizations that were similar. But now that we're kind of sitting, it's 2021, it's in the summer, and we're kind of looking back on what's kind of happened over the last year and a half of time, essentially. And there's some interesting predicaments that we're in, and there's nothing wrong with what organizations have done. And we often at PKI Solutions think of either PKI or security things. They all have to be balanced pragmatically with the requirements of a business. Just because you have a security lever that you can pull and make something tighter or more restrictive or more controlling doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do or the only thing to do. That essentially, as a business, we have to decide what risks we're willing to take and which ones we're not. And we have to make pragmatic decisions. If we simply went into the pandemic and said, no, we can't open any of these things up, we can't deploy new solutions because it can't be done securely, then the organization can't function, and you would have gone out of business or had a much larger problem at hand. Pragmatically, we made decisions around what's the most important thing for us to do, what's the best that we can do, and then managing those risks. Well, now we're kind of at that point where we have a little bit of breathing room. We're up and running. We have the ability to kind of look back and think a little bit about what did we introduce as a result of what we've done. We took something that was typically well controlled through change control and security requirements, and we're now potentially at a place where we need to really analyze and understand what did we do. So a couple of things that we introduced through this approach. One is that a lot of the typical security reviews that we would do of tools and changes and cloud providers and solutions didn't really come to the top of the discussion heap. It was really kind of a secondary thing. It was, we need a tool, let's find a tool. Can we set it up using some security so it's not just anonymous access? But the security discussion was oftentimes the secondary concept. So we didn't necessarily have time or the ability to do as thorough of a security review of a solution or a change as we normally would do. We also wound up in a place where things like network firewalls and protections and proxies and bastion hosts and network segmentations were no longer the only way of controlling access to things. And many times we had to make a change. We had to open things up. We had to make changes. There was no longer necessarily a way of saying this traffic is only going to be on this network and no one can see it. We had a remote workforce. It was no longer going to facilitate that. We also saw a move to new types of communications, whether it was video conferencing, real-time chat tools like Teams and Slack. All of these suddenly had a much greater use throughout organizations. And while things like Teams or Slack may have existed, the dependency on it for moment-to-moment and interpersonal communications grew greatly. For instance, just ourselves at PKI Solutions, all of our customer contacts were primarily through Teams or WebEx to begin with, but we'd also have customer calls, we'd be on site, we'd do deployments, and that suddenly changed to 100% through video communications. Same thing with my doctor friend, the use of telemedicine to meet with upcoming patients that they'll be working with and patient follow-up. What was done almost never in their practice, and really became almost the only way they interacted with patients. And I know even for myself, 4 or 5 months ago, I needed to go see a healthcare clinic, and it was actually difficult to find a in-person appointment as opposed to just setting up a video call. It was much easier to do that, where that was just something, at least in the US, was never really there. So we saw a big rush to those types of video communications. The other types of risk is essentially the fact that if any of these tools were brought in, these new technologies, and they had poor authentication or poor security controls, that they're going to be exploitable. We saw this early on last year with Zoom bombing, if anyone remembers that, where it was found out that most Zoom meetings didn't have a password, and if you could type in, I believe it was 7 or 8 random characters, you were likely to wind up in somebody's Zoom meeting, and that affected classrooms and healthcare and everything else. There was authentication controls. It was a very poor one, and it will be exploitable. The same thing with any of these other solutions that we brought in. If we've implemented some of these solutions and the authentication security isn't as strong as it could be, then at some point someone's going to figure it out. And essentially, if we think about how widely visible the move to some of these tools were, it's frankly not that difficult to see why attackers and others would be interested in finding out how they could exploit some of those authentication systems, because a lot of people have moved to them. Zoom was a great example. The other thing that we run into, frankly, and we see this in other types of shifts in IT, is once something is put in place, it has kind of a stickiness. It just kind of becomes a foregone conclusion, meaning we've deployed this thing, we've got it, we kind of forget about it, move on to the next thing. It's hard to kind of undo something, even if we meant to put it in temporarily. And we see this with PKIs, where somebody stands up a CA to do something temporarily, or they stood up a new one and they meant to get rid of something that's old. It's easy to move on and forget about some of these things. So it's not hard to see that some of these solutions that we've implemented, even if they were meant for a short-term solution, a week, a month, just to get us through the pandemic, they may likely be around for a very long time. So the assumption of this is just a short-term thing may not be as accurate as we'd like it to be. So now that we've kind of covered those fundamentals, what are the 3 things that you could do today to start getting some of these things under control? And hopefully people are at that point in their organization where they have a little bit of time to take this on, because I frankly think it's an important thing. So the first thing is kind of figuring out what systems were affected. And frankly, this could be just as simple as starting with Notepad or an Excel spreadsheet or an email or something, and just start listing the things that changed. What kind of network changes did you make? Did you expand the VPN? Did you start using WebEx and you didn't have that before? Did you make changes to network firewalls? And just identifying what things you may see. And it may even also be what things are allowed to connect to what. So maybe a system didn't necessarily change, but other systems were suddenly connecting to them that they didn't before. And you may not have the visibility across your organization to know all of them. And frankly, most people probably don't. So there's nothing wrong with doing this from a collaborative standpoint. Start with what you have. Start the conversation, the change control, the team meetings, email the group and say, we just want to make a collective list of what these things are so that we can figure out what to do going forward. And many organizations may struggle with even trying to figure out where to start. If you can, start with your business critical systems. Like, what are the things that keep the lights on and make your business work on a day-to-day basis? If you can only list 1 or 2, that's better than none. Start that list and figure out if you can build collectively what those systems are, what those changes were. Don't worry about how they were changed yet or what you're going to do about them. That's the next step. But step 1, figure out what those systems are, and find out who can be your advocate, who wants to be part of that process, and start building that list. Now, once you have the list, start trying to figure out how it was changed. And if you start this process a little too early, you could kind of really get yourself dug into a hole of, I identified these two systems and I know there's probably 100 and I want to start going through the nuance. Start with as many that you can on the list. And then from there, you may even be able to identify application owners that can help you with these. But what we essentially want to do is for each of those systems or application or change is determine how was it modified. Did we change access lists? Did we change processes? Did we change authentication or integration mechanisms? Did the solution exist as a SaaS or a cloud provider? And then how do we interact with that? Do we have to open up something on our firewall? Did we have to have Active Directory LDAP-S turned on? What did we do to facilitate that thing? Did we sign up for a one-time password authentication or a multi-factor process? Essentially going through each of those lists and at least trying to figure out, was it a network change, authentication change? Did we change something? It's all about change, right? So we want to understand what that system introduced. The other thing that we have to think about a little bit is, what about our life cycle? Did we have to make assumptions in our old world versus our new world? For instance, a lot of times the life cycle of a device, a laptop, a mobile device, the assumption was it started with our physical possession. We bought it, it was in our facility, we could manage it, we could configure it, and then we could provide it to an employee. Did that change as a result of these new systems? Are you now shipping laptops directly to employees? Is that onboarding process different? Do they join themselves to Active Directory? And then how do you go about making sure that it gets managed? It gets BitLockered, for instance, and gets all the necessary tools. Were there certain types of things that changed from an IT perspective that wasn't necessarily a new solution or a new SaaS, but really a change in how you operated? And we see this quite a bit now with that life cycle of new employees or employees needing new hardware. That life cycle assumption completely turned around. And then what about baseline security requirements? Did things get loosened or changed to facilitate these new products? Were there either local security policies that changed or things that were pushed out or mandated that had to change to incorporate these new systems? So, making sure we think about group policies or defender policies, any of those things that we're necessarily enforcing on devices, can we understand what types of changes we've made? And then from there, we need to decide what we want to do. If we know how a system was changed, we can make an educated decision as an organization. Are we okay with that change now? Looking back 18 months later, if we implemented a system, we're aware of the security changes that we made, we can give that a concerted discussion and we're comfortable with it. The remediation is you're done, you're okay, check the mark, move on to the next thing. If it's not, then we need to decide what we want to do about it. Some of the things that we need to do when we think about how we're going to respond to this is think a little bit about your threat profile. Historically, we used to be able to categorize these things as remote adversary. Am I concerned about information on my network being breached or accessed by a remote unknown adversary? And the other one was a rogue employee, somebody in my network accessing information I was concerned about. And then third, a rogue administrator. But now with this hybrid workforce, it's a bit different. We have a lot of workers working remotely, which means organizational data is sitting on laptops and mobile devices and home locations much more than it was before. So is our threat profile up to date? If we were simply worried about a rogue employee, and we had controls for that, and we knew that our physical controls in our building kept out that unknown adversary, that may not be the case if somebody's sitting on their home Wi-Fi. So some of those threat profiles need to be updated a bit. We need to figure out what of these systems are outside of our security acceptable standard. So if we know that we've added a new security policy or firewall change to accommodate a system, and if it was under normal circumstances, that never would have happened. We wouldn't have opened up that port. We wouldn't have done that so broadly. We need to at least identify that this is really outside of norms, and we want to determine what we want to do about it. Is the remediation for that finding a better, more secure way of facilitating that access or that interoperability? If there is a way of doing that, what's the timeline? Is this something that we can do overnight, or is it going to take something weeks or months to get there? It may even be replacing the solution entirely. We brought in solution X. It really doesn't meet our security standards. The only way of resolving this is to move to a new system, and that's going to take 6 months. But at least you know what that system is, and as an organization, you can have that conversation around how and what are we going to do about it. The other thing that we could do is really look at some of these changes and figure out how can we add security protections to them, whether it's using certificates and IPsec tunnels, for instance. If we've got some application that isn't communicating as securely as it can, it can't start doing TLS, for instance. What about using a certificate from a PKI, set up an IPsec tunnel so that information is protected, and it's protected from your threat profile. So a remote adversary won't be able to look at that information because it's going through a tunnel. What about encrypting information? Does the system have a way that we can encrypt information either at rest or in a database or in transit? Are there things that we can do with that provider, such as bringing our own keys? Can we generate some keys in an HSM and bring them to a cloud provider as well? So there may be some ways where you could take the existing solution or application and add additional protections around it, whether it was a firewall change or a new application. The other thing that you could do is think about the endpoint access to that. If it's a user accessing, can we add things like two-factor authentication, mutual authentication with certificates or smart cards? Can we somehow improve the overall identification and authentication of that system? So it's not always a matter of what we did is wrong, we need to tear down, move to something else. It may simply be a matter of being aware of what that system is, of what changed, and how we want to go back and make some changes. So what can we do going forward? How do we adapt to this new workforce? I don't think that we're going to rapidly overnight see everyone suddenly back in the office. Will there be a change going forward? Sure. I don't think that the state that we're in is forever. I also suspect that we may see a greater variety of jobs in remote working in the hybrid configuration for quite some time. So what are some of the things we can do? If you're not already doing it, start thinking about stronger identities, things like smart cards, virtual smart cards, two-factor authentication. Start working on improving identification. You're going to have more people outside of your physical boundaries. That just means more passwords, more likelihood for compromise. Improving identities today is a great thing that you can move towards. Also, make sure that where you can, you're using secure network communications. So TLS, IPsec, other types of encryption, routing, network segmentation, where you can assume that somebody's on your network and looking at communications, because it could be essentially somebody's home Wi-Fi now. It's not just who's on our corporate Wi-Fi, who's on our corporate network. We can control those things. It's a lot of people on home Wi-Fis. That you're not going to have those same protections. So making sure that that network layer is already protected. Start thinking about how your hybrid lifecycle and deployment scenarios are going to work for things like devices. How are employees going forward going to get a hardware refresh? Most organizations have maybe a 2 or 3 year life cycle for hardware. Is that going to continue? And then if so, how is that device going to get configured and shipped out to employees? Is that going to come right to the manufacturer and they onboard themselves? There's some great things that vendors are doing in that regard today. Azure Remote Join makes a big difference as well. But thinking about It's not just employees coming in the office, they get a new computer and they run back out. I know back in the day when I was at Microsoft, one of the reasons to go to campus was every 2 years you get a new laptop. So always made a point to be in the office around then. That may not necessarily be the case for every organization going forward. We can also make sure that we're thinking a lot about how employees are remotely accessing our systems and solutions and the security around that. How strong are those identities? Are there things that we could be doing to improve those? It could be that historically your VPN has allowed usernames and passwords, and maybe it's time to start thinking about using certificate-based authentication or moving to some type of token or smart card to facilitate that. Same thing with those SaaS solutions, those cloud providers you're working with. What kind of security controls do you have there? Can you turn on two-factor? Maybe you didn't do that in the beginning. It's simply because you were more concerned about enablement and connectivity and less about making sure security was as tight as it could be. Maybe it's time to revisit those and make sure that your solutions that you use going forward allow you to do things like bring your own key or have two-factor authentication. Also, make sure anything that you can encrypt it. If I could get a T-shirt that says "just encrypt it," I probably would probably wear it. Anything that we can do to improve encryption it is a good thing, and not to a point where businesses can't work. But if there's places essentially where you've got an option to encrypt something or not encrypt something, it's worth at least exploring why shouldn't you encrypt it? What's going to break, or what is the problem that you're concerned about by enabling that option? If a product or solution gives you the option to do it, there should at least be a concerted effort to understand why you shouldn't be enabling that option. And then lastly, think about how are you going to improve remote identification and authentication controls. Stronger identities, as well as making sure that new employees, when they join your organization, I know most organizations are trying to find people to hire. How are you going to identify them and give them their initial credentials? Do you have a good, secure process? Because historically, it was, again, a new employee shows up, they go through HR, they get their credentials, they're sitting on the network. Now you're potentially dealing with a scenario where you have a brand new remote employee, and you're essentially having to identify them from ground zero and securely get them credentials that they'll use going forward. So we really need to make sure that we've got a good way of protecting the initial onboarding process, and then obviously giving them strong identities to use going forward. So with that, we'll move into our Q&A session.
Yes, so as we get into this Q&A portion, please feel free to keep dropping questions in the chat or in the Q&A section of the chat in particular. But just to get things started, I do have a couple of questions, Mark, that came in. Some organizations are, in fact, going to be ending their work from home program pretty soon, fingers crossed, and going back into the office and maybe not doing quite a hybrid model or having people that are distributed. So if an organization is about to end their work from home program, what can they take away here? Do they still need to be taking these steps?
I would say yes, and the odds are that even if these programs are wrapping up, if you deployed a solution to facilitate a remote workforce and you're kind of ending that, or some people are going back in the office, those systems are going to continue to be used, maybe by fewer people, but they'll still be there. The other thing is most organizations aren't necessarily great about ending and decommissioning solutions that they're not using. So even if everybody went back to the office tomorrow, the odds are these solutions would be left on for a period of time, either due to contractual reasons or just in case, or what if we have another surge. I don't necessarily see all of these things changing. And if nothing else, if you go through the process and you make the list and you find that all of your systems have been done securely, or they have been shut down, or there's a defined timeline and the organization's okay with it, you may not need to go through the remediation, but now as an organization, you at least know that you've done due diligence in understanding what's changed and
to
make sure it's been done securely.
So with everything that we've been talking about today during the webinar, is this needed only for systems connecting to the internet, or is there some broader applications to be considering here?
I would say it's pretty much any system that we made a change to facilitate this workforce, because if we focus just on systems connecting to the internet, we may miss the connection to the fact that, yes, we made a change to this system over here that connects to the internet, and now somebody's on a network segment or able to access the system, and that indirectly has access to something else that we made a change to. So if we prematurely excluded that, we could have less than a complete picture. So I would focus as much as I could on what did we change to facilitate this workforce, and then try to understand what their security ramifications are. And it could be, yes, we made this change over there. It's completely unaffected by anything else. And if our threat profile is simply those remote adversaries, then I'm okay. But maybe I made a change internally, and now my employees have more access to something than previously, and we have a little bit of concern about who has access to that information. It may be still something that we want to address.
So that actually leads really nicely into this next question. So what do you do if you don't know all the systems in your organizations that may have been changed? How do you even start?
The funny thing about this is this is essentially the same question that we get whenever we talk about changing cryptographic algorithms and hashing algorithms. It's the what systems are going to be impacted and what are those changes. You have to start with what you can, and I've never gone into an organization that says, yes, here's our list of everything we run. No one has this, and it seems like a big undertaking. But start with what you can. If you can focus on your business critical systems, maybe things have already been identified in a DR plan or something else. But if nothing else, figure out the one or two things that you know and build from there. Sometimes it's just a matter of opening the document, putting one thing down, and then figuring out what you're missing.
Start with what you know. Okay, we've got a couple more questions that have come in here. Do you think PKI-based authentication is best suited for privileged access as opposed to regular access, where other forms of MFA may be easier to manage?
So, I think PKI, when it's done the right way, has a distinct advantage of being able to do something that MFA can't. So a lot of times when we think of MFA, that could be phone factor or text multi-factor. We're narrowing down the possibilities. What I really like about PKIs is if you really wanted to go to the point, we have a little better ability to have absolutes. If I'm using smart cards and issuing those properly, that cryptographic key is only in the possession of one person. And if I'm doing privileged access, like escalating into a domain admin, I have a much higher level of assurance of who's actually exerting that privilege. If you do PKI poorly or insecurely, it doesn't provide as much value. So it's one of those things that with the right oversight, the right controls, then yes, there's a lot of capabilities that I think PKI and maybe even combined with MFA provide some really interesting capabilities for organizations.
So how might PKI and certificate admins provide a higher assurance level of device and service identity for mutual authentication across platforms?
So I think a couple of things that you can do in that regard is when we think about what most systems on a network do for quote unquote secure communications is they use a server-side encryption certificate. So TLS is a great example of this. However, the downside to that is it simply makes sure that the communication is confidential in nature between the client and the server side, and also tells the client that it's really talking to the server it wants. But part of the picture that's missing, and the key that I'm picking up off your question, is mutual. How do we know that the server is talking to a valid system and the client is talking to it? PKI and certificates can provide mutual authentication. So it's essentially like TLS, but it's done on both sides. This provides the ability to make sure that we know what systems are connecting to where. So we could do some really interesting things with firewalls, where rather than just allowing any client to connect to a server, authenticate TLS, and send information back and forth, we could have a firewall that says, okay, client, before you can even talk to this database server, for instance, you need to authenticate to me with a certificate that you really are one of our systems, and then you can talk to the server. We could do the same thing with 802.1x and have wired authentication. Before you can even get on the network and be able to talk, you have to be able to prove to the switch that you're one of our devices. We could do the same thing with VPN. So certificates are a great way of moving beyond things like NTLM and Kerberos and moving to a much stronger authentication and identification system.
So, Mark, I'm curious for you personally, what do you consider the biggest security concern about hybrid work models? You know, taking into consideration everything we've talked about today, you know, is it bring your own device? Is it response time and capacity of InfoSec teams? What to you is the biggest risk?
I would say that the biggest risk has simply been the time factor. Honestly, most organizations, when they would consider bringing on a new solution, making a change, it was often not an overnight decision. It would go to an architecture team, a change control team. It would be discussed, maybe shot down, reviewed, written up before anything was ever done. And I think the biggest risk is the fact that we had to work at a much different pace to respond to the pandemic and get the workforce going. I think the biggest risk is the fact that organizations may not necessarily have had the chance to review things as well as they should have. And it's really the unknown impact. And it's certainly possible that organizations got everything right and everything is as secure as it could be, but they may not necessarily know that for sure. And that's probably the biggest risk in my mind.
So we just got another question in from Paul. And he says there's lots of hype about machine identities with the hybrid model of home workforce and SaaS providers. How do IT service teams keep track of the machines or users that are real before we hand out a certificate?
Yeah, and that's always the hard thing. You know, machine identities for me, it's okay. We're really talking about computer certificates or a identity for a device, and it is kind of a unique challenge. Now, from an employee or a user perspective, we can rely on existing identities that entity has. So you show up to work and you have a driver's license, a passport, a national identity. We have some basis to go off of where we then create credentials for you. But what about this device that shows up from a manufacturer or shows up from an employee? And you know, it's one thing when it was physically done and an employee brought it in and said, this is my laptop or this is my mobile device, then we at least knew what it was. But the issues around, hey, we just had some device spin up somewhere on the internet and says it belongs to one of our employees. Do we want to let it on the network? That's a whole other kind of challenge. Some of the interesting things that we've seen is some of the manufacturers for, like, say, laptops and desktops now have the capability to work with you and your PKI where those devices are spun out of manufacturing with a device identity from your PKI before it ever gets to your employees. So there are some integrated solutions that come from some of these manufacturers. And then there's other types of solutions where employees can onboard their own device. Now Azure AD is a good example of that. I generally see anytime that something says machine identity, it feels a little trendy and IoT-ish, but there's a big underlying problem there that has been around for a while and I think has only gotten more challenging during the pandemic.
So our next question from Matthew, do you see most organizations using device identity certificates from an internal PKI in conjunction with MFA, or are most orgs viewing that device identity certificate as the second factor?
So the second factor or two-factor verbiage comes up quite a bit when we talk to organizations, and frankly, it depends on your solution. But most of the time, if you look at, say, a VPN solution, the authentication historically it used to be, do you want to use a username and password, or do you want to have a certificate? Having a certificate itself and using that as your only means of identification isn't necessarily two-factor authentication. It's just an alternate way of proving your identity. There are cryptographic and security values to using a certificate where it's stronger than a username and password. We do see some solutions that use the term two-factor authentication. I don't like them. They're essentially saying username and password and a certificate, but they're coming from the same entity. They're sitting in the same piece of software. They're not really two-factor. Now, two-factor really used to mean two or three things: physically, something you have, something you know, or something you are. If I use two somethings I have, meaning a certificate, username, and password, then it doesn't quite work because it's right there. There are ways of doing two-factor with certificates, but it would be something more akin to type in my username and password and then insert my token with a certificate. That was something I have. Anytime that you can combine multiple types of authentication, regardless of what you want to call it, even if it's a username and password, and even if it's a certificate in the OS, it's still better than only using one. My hang-up often simply becomes the grammatical of, is that two-factor or multi-factor? But yes, the certificates are probably one of the most common elements that we see when doing two-factor. And sometimes we can see that being done with multi-factor, but frankly, most of the time, if it's a certificate-based authentication, we don't see a multi-factor authentication as part of that as well.
Great. Well, that looks like all the questions we have for this morning. Before we wrap things up and give a little plug for our next webinar we have coming up, Mark, did you have any closing comments or things you wanted to end with?
I think the best thing to end this with is we're all kind of in the same boat. Every organization did the right thing for their employees, for their companies, for their customers. This is not about right or wrong. It's simply about how do we make sure that we're still doing our due diligence from a security perspective, and how do we find a way to continue to evolve both the IT and connectivity and working with the new workforce. This is simply the new reality.
Well, if you do have some additional questions, comments, feedback, anything like that, we always welcome that via email or social. You can find PKI Solutions on LinkedIn and Twitter at PKI Solutions. Mark also has his handles up on screen as well and is always open to your questions and comments afterward. We do want to give a quick plug for our next event, which is coming up Thursday, August 12th at 10 a.m. Pacific. That'll be our next office hours live event, which is totally free. You can come get your questions answered directly from the PKI Solutions team. It's more of a casual conversation and a great chance to tap their brains a little bit. So thank you so much for joining us. It was great to see the international audience we had today. Definitely send us any feedback or questions you have. Keep an eye out for an invite to that August 12th event. And keep an eye out for more to come. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.